Hey YouTube, Joeboy here. So, One Piece chapter 1141 is out. If you guys haven't checked out that chapter yet, I suggest that you do so because I will be spoiling you. But now that you have, let's begin. I just want to let you guys know up front that we've got some hot takes this week. This chapter was insanely exciting. I am freaking hyped. But yeah, this is one of those weird weeks where starting at the beginning of the chapter does not make a whole lot of sense to me. So let's do a short summary of the chapter and then cut through the BS. The whole chapter was about freeing Loki, and that's where Zoro and Luffy went. Zoro is still hell-bent on having a conversation with Loki before he agrees to free him. Zoro wants to judge this man's character first, while at the same time, Luffy has very obviously already decided that he will free Loki. However, all of this is insanely interesting because Loki is already injured. But while they were traveling to go find Loki, Nami and Road, as well as the injured giants, headed back to the village. And it's through these events and Road's inability to have a poker face whatsoever that the new giant warrior pirates, Gerd and Hiruden, found out what Luffy and Zoro are about to do. They do not want Loki to be freed. But it's actually quite a task to get from the Sun Realm to the underworld where Loki is, so they desperately make a beeline on their ship that runs on clouds. Some bad decisions were made, suddenly they're falling in the sky, and it requires Luffy to save them. However, they think that they have arrived in time in order to stop Luffy from freeing Loki. But we find out at the end of the chapter that Loki is already freed, for the most part. One cuff remains, and then Loki stands up and he smiles. So let's just go ahead and say it. Over the last several chapter reviews, we have talked a lot about Zoro. It just felt like to me that Zoro has been acting somewhat strangely, and it's felt like to me that the chapters have encouraged discussion about him and his role on the crew. And what do you know, in this chapter, we do get a little bit of a Luffy and Zoro fight. It seems like all of this conversation has been somewhat fruitful. But I suppose if we're gonna do this, we might as well do this right, because I've noticed something strange. I pointed out something regarding Zoro for about 6 straight chapters. This all began while Zoro and Luffy were still at the party, and Zoro was listening into the conversation between Luffy and the giants. Basically, Zoro is oddly perceptive that Luffy is a bit uncomfortable around the giants. Now, there's a reason that Zoro thought this, because Luffy had already met Loki, found out that Loki was the enemy to giants, and basically had a secret to keep, which he is not too good at doing. So it's real easy to brush this moment away as just Zoro being a really good crew member. He knows his captain. But there were other moments in the same chapter that also had me thinking about Zoro, as if he was like a focus of the chapter. One of these was a thought bubble regarding the sun god, because Elder JARUL and Luffy were talking about it. Zoro as a character is not interested in a whole lot of things. There's a lot of scenarios where people are talking about stuff and Zoro is someplace else, or he's taking a nap mentally. So for Oda to include this panel of like, ooh, Zoro's interest is piqued, struck me as potentially important. And I think in retrospect, you can look at Zoro in the party and say almost definitively that he's not really having fun. Guys, just straight up, if you look at all the other major parties in the story, Zoro's not off in a corner glowering, right? He is involved in the party, but not this one. He's not letting himself relax because he clearly does not trust the giants of Elbaf. This is different than even a few days prior on the Great Eric. Although you could say that Zoro might have a reason for this because they actually got abducted, right? And they ended up in a castle jail cell. But to even take this a step further, we even got dialogue in the chapter between Zoro and Road. Everyone was clowning on Road, and Gerd was apologizing for his behavior. And Zoro said this: "Don't sweat it, it's not like anyone died. Although that's only because Usopp stopped me. If he didn't, it would have been your head." And he gave Road a look. And my opinion at the time is the same as my opinion now. This is a little bit beneath Zoro. This is within Zoro's character to have a moment like this. But Road is the kind of character that would usually be beneath Zoro's concern. It's like Zoro wanted to flex on it. He was boasting, although it was probably true. So when I put all of this together, what I said was I wondered whether Zoro is hankering for a fight. His interest in the sun god, his interest in flexing on the giants, being on edge around them, hyper-focusing on Luffy. The fact is that Elbaf is a legendary island. The warriors of Elbaf are legendary fighters. Maybe Zoro wants to test his blade a little bit, and it's kind of hoping that they end up becoming enemies. And for me, Zoro being in this state of mind in Elbaf works really well considering where we left off in Egghead. It took Zoro a surprisingly long time to defeat Lucci. This was pointed out in the story. The other strats were sort of discussing, like, is Zoro not done yet? Do we have to go find him? And this led to Jinbei and others basically seeking him out. Is he lost? And in the same arc, he also had the opportunity to meet Agorase, and that fight I don't think went as he would have hoped. Zoro is a competitive guy. He holds himself to a very high standard, so it seems reasonable to me to believe that he's dissatisfied with his performance in Egghead. And so all these thoughts worked well in the chapters that followed because Zoro had another conversation with Road where he was basically hoping that Road would admit to being a bad guy, being deceitful, tricking Hyruden into joining his crew. And it seemed as though he was disappointed when he found out that Road is probably an honorable guy in his own way. But yeah, for me, Zoro's disappointment was palpable. After Road demonstrated his good qualities, Zoro was like, this is really boring. I've heard this story before. He did not get the answer that he was looking for. So we move on from this and the focus shifts just a little bit. Now we're talking about Zoro basically bossing Luffy around. It is clear as day that Luffy has already decided that he is going to free Loki. Zoro is obviously not going to change Luffy's opinion regardless of whether or not he decides once he actually meets Loki whether it's a good idea. And Zoro is being a little bit more obstinate than usual, saying point blank, I need to talk to Loki first before we do this. But you could have a discussion about usurping the role of the captain here. Regardless of whether or not Luffy allows Zoro to do this, Luffy is the captain, and Luffy decides who's going to be their ally or not. The hypothetical that it created at the time was, what if Zoro does not think that it's a good idea to free Loki once he talks to him, and then Luffy says, I don't care what you say, I'm gonna do it anyway. Like, that just, it encourages some sort of confrontation, which I thought was interesting at the time. But then even after this, we get the Luffy and Gabon fight, and in that, Oda wants us to question what Zoro's role on the crew is. At the end of the fight, we get to see pretty clearly what Zoro's value to the crew is. And I think that all of this lends towards the ongoing discussion about whether Zoro is the vice captain or he should be. Because we're paralleling the Straw Hat Pirates with the Roger Pirates, and there is a conspicuous lack of a Rayleigh. Zoro very rarely makes decisions for the crew. But I'm not here to annoy you again. The point is that it felt as though Oda wanted us to think about Zoro. And then we got this chapter. You guys feel this, do you not? Something is not quite right. They find Loki injured, and Luffy is immediately like, hey Zoro, lend me a hand. Zoro replies, hold on Luffy, let's wait a bit. And then they immediately start fighting. Immediately. There's not even really any build-up to the fight, they just start arguing. This giant's about to die, we've got to help him. We don't owe him a damn thing. I haven't spoken to him, but we shouldn't take his bad reputation lightly. This guy is as big as oars. And then before Luffy has a chance to do anything, Zoro is attacking Loki. Then Luffy thinks that Loki might be dead, and Zoro says, well, if he is dead, that was simply his fate. And after this, Luffy says something to Zoro that I think he has only said at one other point in the entire story. Luffy calls Zoro a jerk. Guys, the only time that I can remember this happening before is when Zoro attacked Baroque Works, right before Luffy and Zoro had a legitimate fight. But it doesn't stop there. They make an agreement to free Loki, but leave one of the cuffs on. And they're talking about the various things they need to potentially heal him, including a doctor and meat. Zoro says there's plenty of meat over there. Zoro is referring to the defeated animals that are Loki's friends. And then once again, Luffy is immediately mad. He says, all caps, no way, don't even joke about something like that. Those guys are my buddies. And then for some reason, Zoro decides to argue with this captain. He says, meat is meat, isn't it? Luffy is now even madder and says, anyone who becomes my friend is off the menu. So I don't feel like we have to mince words anymore. There is something incredibly strange happening. And I think that there are two ways that you can discuss it. We've obviously spent this entire time focusing on Zoro. Zoro is the character that caught my attention as acting kind of strange. And there's a lot of actual story reasons which would justify why Zoro might be acting this way. Just like the end of the Gabon fight, Zoro's role on the crew is to remain vigilant when danger is present, especially when Luffy does not recognize this danger. He may be disappointed with his performance in Egghead. He may be eager for a fight. He knows that Loki is not a trustworthy guy, and Loki promised Luffy something that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So he's a suspicious fellow. And it shouldn't be forgotten that they literally just got abducted, which should be a wake-up call for Zoro to perform his duties. So essentially this chapter is kind of a reenactment of Baroque Works. Zoro is being vigilant, knows something weird is happening, and Luffy is just kind of is wilding out. If this is how you want to interpret the events in this chapter, then I think that pretty much everything makes sense, with one major exception. So the second way to discuss this chapter, and I'm just going to pose you guys a question. Who do you think was acting more strangely, Zoro or Luffy? Because I gotta be honest with you guys, I have been very, very critical of Zoro. I've hyper-analyzed Zoro. But the reality is, in my mind, that Luffy is acting just as strangely as he is. The best way that I can describe Luffy in this chapter is he is acting childish and absurdly short-tempered. Frankly, he's being a little bit unfair to Zoro, because Zoro doesn't know all these things, which happen to immediately trigger Luffy. And if you want to use the power of hindsight, Luffy was kind of this way as well when he was fighting Gaban. Scopper insulted Shanks in perhaps the most mild way possible, and Luffy flew off the handle. So if I'm gonna criticize Zoro, then I need to criticize Luffy as well, because he's not acting very much like a competent captain. And if we're criticizing both of them and saying that both are on edge and both are acting weirdly, then it has nothing to do with Zoro's particular motivations, because Luffy does not share those. Luffy has no reason to be this way, unless we are talking about something that is happening to both of them related to the country of Elbaf. But yeah, as fate would have it, we've actually already made this theory. I made this theory several weeks ago, and it was just kind of a, this is an idea. Now I think it is more than an idea. Do you guys remember Louis Arnott's warning that there's something about Elbaf that we should be worried about? I personally think that Elbaf has an effect on the emotional state of those that visit it. Or hell, even those that just live there. Elbaf was known as Warland for thousands of years. This could be part of the reason why. But obviously, if we assume this to be true, that there's like an AoE effect of some kind on the people who visit Elbaf, then you wouldn't just see it with Zoro, and you wouldn't just see it with Luffy, you would have to see it with other Straw Hats as well, or the theory does not work. And I think that we are seeing this. Take a look at Usopp in this chapter. There is no question whatsoever that Usopp is acting strangely. Yes, they're making excuses for it. Yes, he's very drunk, but his behavior is noteworthy. Usopp is over here smacking the sword in Elder Jarl's head, asking if someone can pull Excalibur from the stone. Who does that? When does Usopp do that? When is Usopp ever this aggressive? And Brook and Nami comment, oh, he's so drunk, but I guess it can't be helped though because this was his dream. And you can tell. Do not ignore this. Obviously, this is a story, but Oda is telling it, and he's deciding all of the dialogue and all of the panels that are being drawn, and he is literally making an excuse for Usopp's behavior, which confirms that Usopp's behavior is strange. But let's not just stop with Usopp, because another character who was acting kind of strangely in this chapter was Nami. There's a scene with her and Road where she's discussing her disappointment that there was no treasure, and she's doing it very loudly in the open with other giants there, and Road is like, hey, calm down, don't say this so loud. Again, this is not normal. Yes, this is a part of Nami's character. She loves treasure, that sort of thing, but typically she's a little bit more clever and more tricky than that. She's not an idiot. This is just the kind of thing that you would know in the story, not because Nami actually says it, but because there's visual clues, and people who know her, like the other strats, are like, oh, she's got that look, that treasure look, or she might say it under her breath, not loudly in the presence of giants. Just wild. And finally, the last character that I think that you can talk a little bit about is Sanji. Sanji is for the most part normal. I don't think that many people would have read this chapter and been like, Sanji's acting strangely, but then you remember that Nami disappeared from the party, and Sanji has not brought it up one time. Instead, he notices when Gerd goes missing. So guys, here's my theory, right? If you look for the commonality between all of these characters and the situations in which they're acting kind of strangely, I believe that it relates to their dreams. Nami and treasure, Sanji and giant women, really another version of mermaids, Zoro and fighting, Luffy and Shanks returning the hat. If you really think about it, Loki essentially promised to Luffy that he would tell him how Luffy could fulfill one of his most important dreams. And dreams are explicitly the excuse that Oda made for Usopp. He's living his dream. This theory might also explain why some of the other Straw Hats are not yet acting strangely. Jinbei seems normal. Brook seems normal. Why? They haven't hit their trigger yet. With Jinbei, I'm really curious what might happen if giant children go missing, or the idea of slavery or capture by the world government comes up. You might also be thinking that somebody like Robin or somebody like Frankie so far is acting normally. But there's an important party going on, and they are not here. Why aren't they here? because they're obsessed with things related to their dreams. I'd be very curious to see how they would act if you tried to pull them away from what they are currently doing. But yeah, honestly guys, this felt like my big takeaway from the chapter. It felt like this is what unified the whole damn thing. You could even stretch a little bit and apply it to the title of this chapter. The title of this chapter I thought was very strange because there was this throwaway conversation between Usopp and Elder Jarl where Usopp brought up Nami the Navigator, and Elder Jarl was like, oh, she's a beauty. And then Usopp asked him what is his type, and he was like, pretty deadpanned, older women. And for whatever freaking reason, Oda decided that as the title of the chapter. Like, why? It could literally be as simple as Oda wanted to emphasize Elder Jarl and Usopp's interaction in the chapter, because it was through that interaction that we learn Usopp might be consumed by his dreams. Or if you want to add layers to it, it could have something to do with Elder Jarl's personal dreams. Usopp had himself a laugh when he found out that Elder Jarl is into older women, because he is, in fact, the oldest giant in the world. He's 400 years old. There is likely not another woman his age. But there is something in this that Usopp overlooked. This has been repeated over and over again since we've got to Elbaf. The giants are absolutely attracted to humans. So when Elder Jarl is talking, he could be referring to very old human women as well. That would be his age in human years. Honest to God, man, I think that Elder Jarl is talking about Mother Carmel. I think that Elder Jarl was in love with Mother Carmel. But yeah, look guys, I'm not going to pretend like I know every little nuanced detail of what is happening here, but I feel like we have put together some compelling bits of evidence to some kind of general observation. I cannot tell you why this seems to affect the Straw Hats more than the Giants, other than just speculation thrown at the wall like the Giants live here and are used to it. So we'll find out more. But I am absolutely convinced that something about the country of Elbaf is affecting the Strats' emotions, and I think that it is related to dreams and making them aggressive. But I'm pretty sure another thing that people are going to commonly bring up is Fairy Green. Fairy Green is the Giants' booze. It was name dropped, it was revealed at the very beginning of the arc. Nothing has come from it, and now we are literally having a party and Usopp is drunk out of his mind. The only thing that we really know about Fairy Green is that we were warned it could cause hallucinations. This could have a role in what is taking place right now as well, but I personally do not think so. Not yet, at any rate. I don't think that Zoro and Luffy are drunk, but I would absolutely keep Fairy Green in mind, and I will have a theory video about this, attempting to explain it to you guys like Monday or Tuesday. But just as a mild spoiler, I also think that Fairy Green is related to dreams. I was already making this theory before this chapter came out. Anyway, I am 100% under the impression that Elbaf is about to become a shit show. This arc is literally going to become wild. Everything that is happening is a melting pot of utter catastrophe. The Strats are living out their dreams. It's potentially affecting their emotions. It's making them aggressive. They're somewhat turning against one another. We also know that it's important to remain calm if you want to use Haki, and that could have an effect as well. Now they've freed Loki. This is most likely going to have an effect on the Giants. Even if Loki standing up at the end of the chapter and lifting Thor's hammer is a nothing burger and he keels over in the next chapter. Because it should be blatantly apparent that at this point, Luffy does not care at all what other people think. He wants to free Loki, and so it does not matter what Hyruden says, Loki will be freed, one way or another. So the Giants are about to go wild. At the same time, a party is literally going on, Usopp is drunk out of his mind, and I think some form of hallucination is imminent. Oh yeah, and giant children are gonna go missing. This is an absolute masterclass. One of the problems with being this far into the story and the Strats having accomplished what they have already, defeating a Yonko like Kaido, taking on all of the Gorosei, is they're kind of too strong for most realistic enemies that they will face. So it seems like Oda is amping up the difficulty with the island of Elbaf itself. Basically, he's giving the villains plot armor, and you love to see it. But yeah, I think that the only other thing that I have to say about this chapter is, even more than I was before, I am totally convinced that all of this chaos is absolutely going to lead to the destruction of Elbaf. Elbaf will burn to the ground and sink into the ocean. Ripley explains to us that the greatest threat to the country of Elbaf is fire and lightning. Treasure Tree Atom is very, very old and it catches fire easily, and once it starts burning, it does not stop. The only way that they can get around this is by literally chopping off branches before the rest of the tree catches. Guys, I told you this at the very beginning of the arc, but Oda loves to front-load foreshadowing at the start of an arc and then go on a long and winding adventure where you forget about all the things that he talked about before eventually coming back to it later. And so the diorama with Road and the strides, all of that is probably going to end up being foreshadowing related to the rest of the arc. And among that was the idea that the tree would catch fire. That is a big deal. In my opinion, guys, this will 100% happen. Elbaf is doomed. Also pretty interesting that as we got to see a chopped off branch, it almost appeared as if the tree is hollow. Wonder if that might come up as well. If you ask me where I think that we might eventually find the poneglyphs that are located in Elbaf, my guess now is that they are inside of the tree, which is something that we have seen before, right? In Zo. But yeah, the story literally could not be any more exciting to me. I love these character interactions, and I know that it annoys some people and that Zoro and Luffy annoy them in this chapter, but it's these kinds of things that create drama, that makes for moments we will never forget. Even if Oda has to use plot to make an excuse to make it happen, I am 1000% here for it. But I think that that is everything that I had to say today. As always, I'm curious as to what you guys think, whether you know something from the chapter that I might have missed. Share your thoughts. If you're interested, check out my book, The Booms. Link is in the description. Like the video, subscribe, click the bell to be notified, join the squad, and as always, guys, have a wonderful day.